On June 13th of 2026, the official White House Twitter account posted an anime edit hyping up President Donald Trump and the USA with the text, "Mission accomplished." This seems to be at least part in reference to a possible end of the war with Iran, which had just started to be reported on around that time. The longest clip in the edit was from the show My Hero Academia, and shows the hero, All Might, known as the symbol of peace, executing his ultimate attack, United States of Smash, where he yells, "United States of Smash," when he punches the villain as hard as he can. In the context of the edit, this clip is obviously being used to promote US nationalism and military dominance, and it serves this purpose perfectly. If you've never seen MHA, and if not for the quality of the animation, you might even think this clip was AI generated specifically for this edit, like other parts of the vid clearly were. So I want to ask, why is that? Is the White House twisting the meaning of this clip and of My Hero Academia more broadly to suit their US imperialist propaganda purposes, or are they not doing that? Are they representing the original intended sentiment correctly? In other words, is My Hero pro-US militarism and imperialism, or is it not? Let's get into it. So the interesting thing about this question is that the world of MHA is directly based on the real world. The show is set in a fictional variant of our own where most people, roughly 80% of the population, have X-Men style genetic mutations that give some people superpowers and other people get, whatever the hell this is. But otherwise, the world is the same. The underlying plot for vast portions of the story is based around the main characters going to school and competing for internships and jobs. It's low fantasy, not high fantasy, and nation states like Japan and the USA exist in the world of MHA. So to answer this question, we can kind of just look at how the US is portrayed. What does the show say about it? Fair warning, going forward, this video will have spoilers for the entirety of My Hero Academia. So the main appearances that the US makes as a character of sorts in the story are during the Star and Stripe arc and the Final War arc, and it's kind of an interesting progression. At the beginning of the Star and Stripe arc, All Might sends out a request for aid from foreign heroes to stop Tomura from becoming a complete vessel for All for One. We get a series of panels from within the UN where politicians are considering this request and basically saying that they can't do it because of paperwork and red tape, and the fear that if their heroes leave home, then it'll leave them vulnerable to major crime syndicates. But then the representative from the US says that their main hero, Star and Stripe, has already left, deciding to ignore the red tape to respond to the request of her former mentor, All Might. We're told that she is the strongest woman around and the hero who reigns supreme in the land of the free, the home of the heroes. She shrugs off cheap tricks and petty tactics. Star and Stripe flies to Japan on top of a squadron of high-tech fighter jets to fight Tomura. She absolutely smacks him around for a bit, but it also pretty quickly becomes clear that he's not gonna go down easy. She decides she needs to call in a special favor and get the US military commander, Timothy Agpar, to send her a barrage of state-of-the-art hypersonic intercontinental cruise missiles so that she can punch Tomura with them and hopefully make him dead. Unfortunately, this plan does not work. Tomura survives and goes on to take part in the Final War. In the lead up to the Final War, we get a view into the White House itself. We see Commander Agpar telling the president of the United States that this is the moment to strike, that the US should intervene and stop Tomura. The president tells Agpar that Tomura is already beyond anything humanity can stop, and that Agpar made a mistake in allowing Star and Stripe to use the missiles to fight him. He suggests that the US should take the side of Tomura and earn his trust. Agpar tells the president that if they try to appease Tomura now, then they won't have a future, but he fails to convince him. Later, during the final battle, as Class 1A and others are all helping Midoriya run towards the reincarnated All for One to deliver his final smash, we're shown a few panels of the president of the US changing his mind and yelling to a subordinate, "Send every hero we've got over to Japan now." The subordinate says, "But Mr. President, if All for One wins today, you would be putting our nation's security in jeopardy." But the president doesn't give a damn. He says, "Like I give a damn. Just do it." It's clearly meant as a triumphant moment, a turning of the tide. Immediately before this, we get a flashback to Ochako telling Midoriya that his hero name, Deku, just screams, "Do your best." And after, we see more panels of people we know yelling for him to do his best, ending the chapter with Toshinori saying that Midoriya has been his greatest hero, and his mom also telling him to do his best, right as he squares up to deliver his final punch, which he does, winning the fight and getting a final touching moment with Tomura in the Vestige world. The final direct appearance that the US makes is immediately after this, actually. The very next chapter starts in Seattle, Washington, with the weather person explaining that they're now expecting clear skies across the entire US after Deku punched the bad weather away. We then move back to Japan, where reconstruction efforts are ongoing. The translation for the manga tells us that the United States and many other nations showed up with an outpouring of support and resources, and the translation in the sub for the anime says that lots of aid started pouring in from overseas, with the US leading the charge. And I think that's it. I think those are all the main notable direct appearances we get of the US as a distinct entity, but make no mistake, the US in slightly more indirect ways is all over this show from start to finish, and I'll talk about that more later, but first, let's see if we can figure out what these direct appearances are telling us. During the Star and Stripe arc, we are clearly told by the framing that the US should intervene in Japan to stop Tomura and All for One, and that the red tape and paperwork that stand in the way are bad. When Star and Stripe takes off on her own to fight Shigaraki despite the red tape, this is unambiguously portrayed as a good thing. Commander Agpar says as much, telling Cassie that your flagrant defiance from the rules really has made our nation shine all the brighter. After this, when Agpar is telling the president to intervene and the president refuses and considers appeasing Tomura instead, we're clearly meant to side with Agpar and to view the president's decision as wrong and cowardly. Later, when the president changes his mind and decides to send every hero we've got to Japan right now, this is clearly the right decision. As mentioned just a moment ago, a triumphant and cathartic release of sorts. It's also notable because it doesn't need to be there. Like, the president of the US isn't a named character, actually. Like, we know he's the president, but we don't know what his name is in universe, and showing him here doesn't impact the story in any way. We never see the heroes who he says to send. The author, Horikoshi, is going out of his way to show us at the climax of the entire story that the US is in on this somehow. Taken all together, the message from these direct appearances is clearly that it is good when the US intervenes around the world, and that political red tape is what stands in the way of the US doing the right thing and intervening more freely in foreign conflicts. We're also directly told that when the US does intervene around the world, it helps to rebuild after in a benevolent way. Now, in the world that My Hero Academia has constructed, this reasoning holds up. We do want the US or anyone to intervene and stop Tomura and All for One from destroying and or subjugating the entire world. Remember though, the world of My Hero is strongly based on our own, and the themes and lessons from the show are unambiguously also meant to reflect back onto the real world. And in the real world, this pro-US interventionist message has been used to justify arbitrary, pointless war in the name of combating evil since even before the Second World War, but especially since. This is how we got the Korean War, which killed as many as 5 million people and led to the creation of separate North and South states. This is how we got the war in Vietnam, which killed as many as 4 million people and accomplished literally nothing. This is how we got Iraq in 2003, which killed an estimated 2.4 million people and established a government which, as of 2023, almost 60% of Iraqi citizens say is worse than what they had before. And this is how we got Iran in 2026, which has already killed over 8,000 people in just a few months. In constructing a world and a scenario where it is entirely justifiable and even desirable that the US intervene on the other side of the world by cutting the red tape and throwing caution to the winds, Horikoshi is encouraging us to view the idea of US intervention in this way. And to be clear, IRL, people do justify these kinds of interventions every time they happen, and they very often do so by by making shit up, plain and simple. For example, the second Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was used to justify the war in Vietnam, was fully fabricated. It did not happen. The NSA has admitted as much. Similarly, as we all now know, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003. Senior administration officials knowingly lied to the public to justify the war, and now in 2026, it's the exact same thing. Iran does not have nuclear weapons, nor do they have the capability to produce them, nor is there any credible evidence that they have plans to develop those capabilities. Warhawk politicians from the US and Israel have been whipping this fantasy out since the 90s, and it's never been true. It's a fictional narrative constructed to make the idea of US military intervention in a sovereign nation on the other side of the world seem justified and desirable. Just like the WMDs for Iraq, just like the Gulf of Tonkin for Vietnam, and weirdly enough, just like the final arcs of My Hero Academia. So in this sense, yes, the White House is using that clip of All Might punching All for One and shouting United States of Smash correctly, in good faith, in line with the rhetoric of the show itself. And I know that's going to be a hard answer for some people to take. You might say, well, you're missing the forest for the trees, looking at just a few specific parts of an over 400 chapter story, and that's a fair critique. So let's look at some larger context. Let's talk about the politics of My Hero Academia more broadly, and I think a good place to start is by talking about the relationship between the US and Japan IRL after the Second World War. To be clear, this is a massive and deeply complex topic that I am not going to be able to fully unpack in this video, but I think it's still useful for us to talk about it even in broad strokes, as it's obviously extremely relevant cultural context for this story. In the wake of the Second World War, the US established a military government and occupation in Japan. This occupation lasted for almost 7 years, roughly twice as long as the war in the Pacific itself, and it's hard to overstate the impact that this period of time had on Japan culturally and politically. This is why baseball is the most popular sport. This is why the thriving fashion culture is so strongly based on US trends. This is why we get one of these guys in most classic shonen anime. During the occupation, Supreme Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur was ostensibly tasked with demilitarizing Japan and turning it into a democracy instead of a monarchy. However, in practice, he drew a clear line between permissible and impermissible ways of bringing about this democratic revolution, and he drew this line on the conservative side. Domestically, labor and socialist organizations were repressed, a possible 1947 general strike was prohibited, media was heavily censored, and conservatives who had been involved in the atrocities of the imperial conquest were quietly put back into positions of power. Internationally, Japan became the foremost military outpost of the US as it waged wars and conducted military operations throughout Asia and the Pacific, which were predominantly concerned with stemming the tide of international communism. Currently, the Japanese constitution, which was effectively written by the US, forbids them from having their own military, while the US stations roughly 55,000 troops in the country, more than anywhere else in the world by almost 20,000. This has led people across the political spectrum in Japan to refer to their nation as a vassal state of the US, meaning that they see Japan as being dependent upon and or subordinate to the US in crucial ways. Critics on the left generally frame this as a critique of Japan's role in US imperialism and hegemony, while those on the right are generally less critical of the US and more focused on the importance of Japan once again becoming a military powerhouse in its own right alongside the US. Now, I don't know Kohei Horikoshi. I can't tell you the nuances of his views on the relationship between Japan and the US, but what I can tell you is that based on a straight read of the material, My Hero Academia treats Japan as if it is part of the United States. We never see the actual government of Japan in the story other than the fictional Hero Public Safety Commission. We never see the Prime Minister or the Kantei or any other officials who are not directly involved in the fictional hero apparatus. At every point where it might make sense for us to see the Prime Minister minister or some other real Japanese government official. We instead see the president of the US, or Commander Agpar, or one of Star and Stripes' fighter jet bros. As I mentioned earlier, the literal first reaction we get after the end of the final battle is from that random news anchor in the United States. She gets a whole page to wax poetic about strong winds coming in the wake of a great battle before we get to check in on any of our main characters or anyone actually in Japan where the battle took place. Narratively, the geopolitical center of My Hero Academia is the United States, and nowhere is this more obvious than when looking at the character who starts the story as the greatest hero and the symbol of peace. All Might is very clearly American coded. Now, I know technically in the story he is Japanese, but he's also blonde-haired, blue-eyed, dresses in red, white, and blue, trained and lived in the US, and is obviously always yelling America stuff. If we look at the role he plays in the story as well, I think it's pretty obvious early on that he's meant to be a direct analogy for the role of the US in Japan post-World War II, which we talked about above. We're told that All Might showed up during a period of instability and general villainy around the world. He reduced crime precipitously and established a new era of law and order. This backstory and his nickname, the symbol of peace, are a clear and I have to assume intentional metaphor for the concept of Pax Americana, the idea that since World War II, the military and economic might of the US has helped maintain a period of relative stability and prosperity around the world, at least so far as Western capital interests are concerned. At the start of the story, we're told that All Might's power is fading, and Midoriya, who unlike Toshinori is unambiguously, clearly Japanese, must take up the mantle. I think we can see some pretty clear parallels here to the conservative neo-nationalists in Japan who want to build up independent Japanese military might after decades and decades of depending on the US. In MHA, the threat that Midoriya faces as he takes up this responsibility is that the villains who All Might has kept in check are going to rise up again. Now, when I mentioned the topic for this video in my last one, I got a comment from 96ace96 saying, amongst other things, that the left is basically non-existent in the story of MHA, and this is not true. To understand the politics of MHA, it is essential to understand that the left is extremely present in the story. The villains are the left. The villains in MHA are, with very few exceptions, clearly and intentionally leftist coded. In other words, they represent the very same societal elements and political factions that the US worked to suppress both within Japan, domestically during the occupation, and throughout Asia and the Pacific, using Japan as a military stronghold ever since. To be clear, I don't mean that the villains represent any kind of actual coherent leftist politic, but in terms of how they're portrayed as a caricature of how reactionaries and many in the mainstream view the left. This is consistent throughout the entire show. To give just a few examples, the first time we see Tomura introduced, he drops this line about All Might, saying, "Throwing punches to save people. That's our state-sponsored violence." In the real world, who complains about state-sponsored violence? Not the right, not fascists. They love state-sponsored violence. No, the left complains about state-sponsored violence. Later, when the Meta Liberation Army is first being introduced, we see a random villain, Teruo Hazukashi, go attack an office building, and he says, "From as far back as I can remember, I've lived my life as a bootlicker. Worthless company, once you're good and gone, liberation, liberation." IRL, who complains about corporations and bootlickers? Not conservatives or even liberals. They love bootlicking. It's like their whole thing. No, IRL, the people who criticize corporations and bootlickers and talk about liberation are the left. We get more of this exact thing later when Skeptic, the hacker villain, is trying to take down the coffin in the sky. Just to pull a few quotes from a little monologue he gives, "All will know true freedom and anarchy, marked by the absence of so-called heroes and villains. The dregs of the old order mustn't survive the revolution. The fools at my company tried to cut me like any other loss. Who do they think built this network anyway? Conservatism taken too far is the death of critical thinking." IRL, who talks about anarchy and revolution and complains about corporations not recognizing the full value of their workers? The left. It's obviously the left. Now, to be fair, it is true that we do see a group who are openly bigoted and right-wing coded in My Hero Academia. At the start of the Meta Liberation Army arc, we are briefly introduced to the Clan. That is, the Creature Rejection Clan, i.e. a fictional cult that views heteromorphs as less than human. Now, who fights this fictional allegory for the Clan? Is it the heroes? No. It's the League of Villains. IRL, who fights the IRL clan? Is it the cops? No. Remember, some of those who burn crosses are the same that work forces. IRL, the people who fight bigots, are the left. I want to be clear here that I am not cherry picking these examples. This is how the villains are represented consistently throughout the entire story. The obvious fact is that My Hero Academia is a story that loves the status quo and is worried about losing the status quo to systemic societal change. When Stain and Tomura first meet, the one thing they can agree on is that destroying the status quo is the one ambition we have in common. Later, again, when Lemillion is fighting Tomura in the Coffin in the Sky, he asks him, "Why do you destroy?" And Tomura replies that he destroys because the current framework has failed. There are dozens and dozens more quotes like this throughout the series. It's not subtle. My Hero Academia is a story about heroes who fight villains, but it is also just as much a show about how the current state of global capital hegemony is good and how anyone who doesn't like it is nothing more than a petulant child. Now you might say, but wait, the story is sympathetic to the villains. It gives us plenty of reasons to sympathize with them, and don't these sympathies serve as critiques of the status quo? Well, no, actually, they don't. I think we can split the villains into two main categories. Firstly, there are those who have actual societal critiques and goals, such as the Meta Liberation Army or the heteromorphs of the Paranormal Liberation Front. And secondly, are villains who want to destroy hero society for personal reasons, be it a traumatic backstory or just like an inherently evil nature. Here, of course, I'm talking about Tomura and All for One respectively. Now, the important thing with all of these villains is that regardless of how sympathetic they are or aren't made to be, or even whether they have actual concrete objections to hero society or not, none of their desires to change the status quo are portrayed as valid or justified or even really engaged with in a serious way. They are at most portrayed as perhaps understandable or humanizing in a way, but ultimately destructive, harmful, and villainous. This is because the root of their villainhood, so far as the story is concerned, is just that they want to change the status quo of hero society rather than working within it. And this, on its own, makes them villains. Let's look at some examples to see what I mean here. The Meta Liberation Army, led by Redestro, is clearly portrayed as a leftist revolutionary organization. They want to do away with quirk restriction laws, which say that no one can use their quirk in public unless they're a licensed hero. This goal is consistently framed as being about liberation over suppression, wielding one's abilities freely as a basic human right. Redestro himself says that they published Destro's memoirs to incite rebellion against the state. Now, the MLA is not made to be sympathetic, really at all. Redestro is consistently portrayed as a shrewd and calculating psychopath, and is never really given much backstory beyond the fact that he's the son of the original Destro, but they do have this clear goal regarding quirk restriction laws. The problem is that the story never asks whether that goal is good or not, which is kind of crazy because it is a huge societal question, right? We're told that 80% of everyone is born with a quirk, but that it's illegal for anyone to use them in public unless they're a professional hero. And TBH, that does seem pretty oppressive, right? It's not like you can't use your quirk to harm people or in a way that's disruptive to others. You just can't use them at all. And the question of whether this is necessary or not is never really engaged with because, again, in the way the story is told, it just doesn't matter. The status quo is unassailable. It cannot be questioned. We can see this same thing in a slightly different fashion with Spinner and the heteromorphs of the PLF, who are also clearly portrayed as left-leaning in nature, being primarily concerned with gaining civil rights and social equality. Now, unlike Redestro and the MLA, the heteromorphs of the PLF are portrayed as sympathetic. I strongly suspect that Horikoshi based the Central Hospital assault story on the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests that took place in the US and around the world. Timing-wise, he would have been writing those chapters just a few years after the pinnacle of those protests, and the story he did write reads exactly like a conservative centrist critique of the IRL protests. The heteromorphs are tired of being discriminated against and harassed based on their physical appearance, which is apparently very common common, so they decide to join the PLF to help tear down the system. There's an obvious through line of the crowd being manipulated by the PLF advisor Takai into being more violent and disruptive, while Tentacle and Anima try to talk them down. Takai tells the crowd that the whole wicked system has turned a blind eye for too long. We are martyrs for the revolution. Blood spilled today will lead to rights for future heteromorphs. Don't stop to think. Bring it all crashing down. Tentacle says that he wears a mask because he doesn't want people to see the scars on his face and assume that he might be out for revenge, since he was scarred after being assaulted because of the way he looks. He tells Spinner that his actions are going to set heteromorphs back 30 years and tells the crowd that instead of overthrowing the system, they should change those who inflict harm until they find it in themselves to be ashamed of their cruelty. He tells them that his response to the cruelty he's experienced is to be the coolest hero the world's ever seen, to give good memories to generations to come. The rep for the crowd says, "I think maybe we're using our anger in the wrong way, and that I couldn't bring myself to hurt the folks in that hospital." And I think we should ask, why are they attacking a hospital in the first place? In a literal sense in the story, it's to try to break out Kurogiri, who is being held there and could turn the tide of the war in their favor. But I think it's also pretty obviously because Horikoshi seemingly can't conceptualize the demands of those who want systemic change as anything other than indiscriminate and wanton destruction. To be clear, the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 did, and ongoing abolition efforts do, strive to change the status quo of policing and prisons and racialized capitalism more broadly, but in specific ways and for very good reasons. We want to stop wasting money on bloated and militarized police departments. We want to start funding services that actually address the conditions that cause crime to occur in the first place. And we want to move away from the criminal punishment system that sees 70% of people released from prison getting rearrested within 3 years nationally. We want these things because the system is expensive, ineffective, and cruel, and also because we've seen cops unalive an average of 3 people a day in this country over the last decade. In My Hero Academia, this context is all flattened to a simple abstract disagreement between challenging the status quo and working within it. We are told clearly that the discrimination and violence that the heteromorphs face is real, severe, and relatively commonplace, but also seemingly only exists at an individual interpersonal level, not a systemic one. In this fantasy context, Takai is portrayed as a fanatical zealot, Spinner is portrayed as a drugged out and brain-dead puppet, and the crowd are simply naive sheeple being manipulated into attacking a hospital. The alternative path that Tentacle offers is to not push for systemic change, which the story tells us isn't needed, but rather to work within the current status quo, voice grievances, and trust the cops to handle it. Just a quick aside here to clarify, the heroes in My Hero Academia are cops. Like, it's not that deep, it's not subtle or ambiguous, that's just what they are. Now, I can hear someone typing in the comments, actually, the heroes and police are different. The heroes are allowed to use their quirks and decide on their own when they do or don't fight villains. The cops can't use their quirks and have to show up for normal cop shifts and stuff. And, okay, fine, you got me. The heroes aren't normal cops, they're superpowered cops who have more autonomy than actual cops. Great. The closest analogy for what they would be in the real world is still cops. We are told in the literal first chapter of the manga in explicit terms that they are paid by the government to fight crime. That's cops. It is what it is. There's no two ways about it. The heroes are cops and the villains are criminals. They are unambiguously referred to this way throughout the entire story. Now, back to talking about the criminals, what we clearly see from these first 2 examples is that it does not matter whether they are portrayed as sympathetic or not, or even whether their cause is portrayed as sympathetic or not. Challenging the status quo means that you are a villain. End of story. And as much as this is true for the villains who have actual societal critiques, it's even more so true for those who don't. I think it's pretty clear when it comes to the 2 main villains of the story that Horikoshi intends to portray Tomura as an anarchist and All for One as a communist. Now, again, to be clear, I am not saying that either of them actually represent those politics based on how they are portrayed, but they do represent a reactionary caricature of how the mainstream views those ideologies. With All for One, I know that it might be tempting to view him as a critique of the bourgeoisie, of CEOs or corporations. After all, his whole thing is greed and control, we're told that he was imbued with a hubris and a disrespect of others from the moment of his birth, that he viewed all within reach as his own possessions. If we try to fit this into a class analysis of the real world, then yeah, it could be a critique of private property and bourgeois greed, but that's not how the story is told. In MHA, All for One is the way he is, literally just because he was born wrong. The story explicitly tells us so, and also, I think it's worth noting, tells us that he was born to a schmex worker, who is clearly depicted as a lowlife, so to speak, drinking in an alley in dirty clothes during the middle of the day. I think this detail is interesting because, much like those panels of the president during the climax of the final war, it's really entirely unnecessary. It doesn't add anything to the story. We don't need to know anything about Zen and Yoichi's mom. It's just a random detail that Horikoshi goes out of his way to add, telling us that, just by the way, the inherently evil master villain for the whole series was born to an indigent schmex worker. Just FYI. If we're looking for class dynamics in this story, then that's gotta mean something, right? The main point I want to make about All for One, though, is that he pretty clearly embodies a very common conservative critique of their straw man idea of communism, that communists or leftists generally just want free stuff. When people suggest that we should guarantee healthcare and housing and other basic human rights to people to the fullest extent we're able, reactionaries don't take this as an aspirational goal for society rooted in a care for others. They frame it as selfishness. Their critique often goes further to say that since those basic human needs require labor, saying that they should be free is saying that you are entitled to the labor of others. They commonly equate this to slavery, saying that communism is the same as forced labor for everyone in order to provide free stuff to poor people who just want to leech off the welfare state. Now, this rhetoric is, as a matter of form, constructed in bad faith and only makes any sense at all in the kind of liminal thought experiment realm that libertarians love to hang out in, where society is being constructed from the ground up and there are no pre-existing class relations or power structures or institutions or policy decisions that shape our society as it currently exists, but it does, for all that, map very cleanly onto the motivations and goals of All for One. I don't think it's much of a stretch to speculate that Horikoshi intended All for One to represent his idea of communism and One for All to represent his idea of capitalism. All for One being about taking others' powers for oneself in order to control everyone, and One for All being about the ability to freely give your own power to others. A strawman authoritarian command economy versus the miraculous innovation of free trade, very loosely speaking. I think it goes without saying that All for One is not portrayed as sympathetic. He is, for all intents and purposes, inherently evil, but this is not the case for Tomura. Sympatheticvillains.fandom.com lists Tomura's official villain type as tragic anarchist. He only cares about destruction. He wants to destroy All Might and Hero Society, and perhaps even the world itself. He tells Stain that he wants to destroy everything he doesn't like and crush the society that worships All Might into dust. After his talk with Midoriya in the mall, he says that his conviction is to cause enough destruction to show them all how fragile their justice really is. He tells Bakugo that we've all suffered thanks to rules, thanks to heroes, we've felt suffocated. He tells Midoriya that your system's all rotten from the inside with maggots crawling out. When the heroes talk about Tomura, they consistently refer to him as a loser and a child. After the USJ attack, when the heroes are first discussing him, All Might says that he does whatever he wants. He's a man-child. When Lemillion is fighting him in the coffin in the sky, he remarks that, "Oh, you've never had any friends." The crux of his character arc for the final battle is whether Midoriya can help him heal his inner child, since that's why he's evil, because of his unhealed childhood trauma. This is how anarchists are viewed by the mainstream, as if they simply want to destroy the status quo because it's not working out for them personally, because they don't want to play by the rules that everyone else has to play by. There's a ubiquitous and infantilizing dismissal of anarchists as children who just need to grow up and get with the program, program that perfectly mirrors how we see Tomura represented in MHA. Horikoshi, like the mainstream, can't engage with the question of whether or not the status quo is actually good, whether institutions like the police and bourgeois representative democracy do actually serve the best interests of the people, because he knows that even asking those questions will lead many people down the path to realizing that no, actually, they don't. There's this line from Tomura when the League of Villains is trying to win Bakugo over after capturing him, which I think sums this up very well. He says, "Our war is based on a few simple questions. What is a hero? What is justice? Is this what society's really supposed to be like? Once we get people thinking about this stuff, that's when we've won." And I think this is Horikoshi showing his cards for a second. MHA is a story about hero society and the fight to preserve it, but the show never seriously engages with the question of whether that society should be preserved in its current form. We get acknowledgments that there are rough edges to hero society, sure. Endeavor is a terror to his family for the sake of chasing the rankings, which leads to his wife going insane and 2 of his children being permanently scarred and worse. Lady Nagant tells us about recurring extrajudicial assassinations that happen for political reasons. It also seems like regular people who aren't heroes might not be doing too well in society. The most obvious example of this is Uraraka's family, who work construction but are seemingly too poor to adequately feed themselves all the time. The point is, hero society does give us lots of reasons to genuinely ask, is this what society's really supposed to be like? But the only answer we're ever given to any of these problems is that the individuals need to change themselves, not the system itself. Endeavor needs to apologize to everyone. Lady Nagant needs to voluntarily stay in jail so she doesn't get manipulated again. Uraraka needs to get those big hero bucks so she can afford a balanced diet. This is basically the core moral argument of the show, that the answer to all the problems people have with society is just for everyone to constantly be ready to lend a hand and help each other out. It's the standard conservative argument for individual responsibility rather than systemic change. In the second to last chapter of the manga, we see a grandmother lend a hand to a young boy who would otherwise clearly be on the path to villainhood, and she tells him, "That day, Izuku Midoriya demonstrated to society the need to support each other. He taught us that sitting back and doing nothing isn't an option. You'll be just fine, cause Granny is here to help." And listen, the message that we should all try to help each other out and lend a hand more is good on its own, but context matters. And in the context of societal scale problems, in a story where the entire country of Japan was just in shambles, in literal rubble, saying that the solution is just for Granny to pitch in more, grandma just needs to do some DIY social work and then this will never happen again, that's crazy, right? Like, that's genuinely a bonkers moral for this story, but it's also, unfortunately, the only one it's left itself. It spent its entire runtime telling us that making any kind of change beyond an individual level is bad. The only people who ever try to make systemic change in the story are the villains, and the ways they try to do so are indefensibly destructive and villainous. The story is constructed such that we are compelled to root against everyone who wants to change the status quo because of the tactics they are using, and therefore we are also compelled to root for the status quo. There is no friction here because the underlying politics of the show are reactionary, viewing any desire for societal change as inherently violent and destructive. From this standpoint, it makes total sense that All Might yells the names of places from the US when he punches villains. The United States is and has been since the end of World War II the global backer of the Western status quo that My Hero Academia so closely mirrors. This has largely been carried out through coercive trade relations that are advantageous to the US and wealthy allies such as Japan, the obvious threat posed by the unchallenged global military hegemony of the US, the economic stick and carrot of the IMF and the World Bank, and countless covert regime change operations all around the world over the course of the last century. Anytime some upstart politician in the global south somewhere decides that they don't want their country's natural resources being expropriated by Western corporations for pennies on the dollar, the US is there to hit them with the Wyoming smash. Whenever some group of people decide that they want their land back from the colonizers who stole it from them, the US is there to hit them with the Delaware Smash. And God forbid any poor backwater nation finds itself sitting on untapped oil reserves and doesn't want to sell them off to Western corporations, the US is there to hit them with the Texas Smash. These oppressive and exploitative relations are the pillars upon which Western capitalist society is built, so when My Hero Academia depicts that society and shows people wanting to change it, and All Might or Deku show up to punch them and shout about Washington, D.C. or whatever, it's not an accident. Horikoshi knows what he's doing. His politics are on full display throughout the entire story, and he's very clearly a reactionary, conservative centrist. It would honestly be weird if there wasn't a healthy dose of America in the story, because again, the US has been the backer of reactionary politics the world over, including very much so in Japan since the end of the Second World War. Horikoshi knows this, and that's why he wrote his main heroes the way he did. It's not deep. The hero called the symbol of peace shows up, punches the bad guy, and shouts, "America." It is exactly what it seems like on the surface. It is exactly what the White House Twitter account makes it out to be. And I think that's all I have to say about it for now. If you're still here, thanks for watching all the way to the end. Please like, comment, subscribe, and if you appreciate this kind of content and you've got a couple extra bucks to spare each month, please go support me on Patreon. This channel is still really small, and I make basically no money from this at the moment, so truly anything you can pitch in would help me keep making more content like this in the future, and also get you some added perks like the ability to vote on video topics and occasional bonus content. I was thinking about doing a short bonus video with my thoughts on Stain, who I think is a super interesting character but didn't quite fit into this main vid. If I can get like 3 people who would want to see that to go support me on Patreon, then I'll go ahead and make that happen. Either way, thanks again for watching. Extra thanks to my 6 current patrons, and I'll see y'all next time.